in light of what they are suffering within their countries. Development challenges differ from one country to another in the Arab region, of course. At this session, we shall hear a presentation of countries' experiences and country assessment through practical approaches and the coordination of plans and national policies according to the data and main principles and SDGs of the 2030 agenda. What are the milestones and achievements that have been done? What are the challenges for implementation? And what are the hurdles that impair this process? We welcome Mr. Ahmed Kamali, Advisor to the Minister of Planning, Monitoring and Administrative Reform for Planning and Monitoring, Egypt. His Excellency Mr. Khalid Mahdi, Secretary General, Supreme Council for Planning and Development, Kuwait. Mr. Muhammad Ahmed bin Hassan Al-Hamadi, Secretary General, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Qatar. Mr. Rifat Hijazi, Advisor to the Chairperson, Planning and International Cooperation Commission, Syria. Mr. Mohammed Al-Hawri, Undersecretary of the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation for Economic Studies Sector, Yemen. I would like to welcome you all. Thank you for coming. We start with Mr. Mahdi to give us an eye-bird view of the Kuwait's country experience. Allow me first and foremost to extend my deepest thanks to His Excellency Dr. Hamad Al-Hakim, the Executive Secretary of ESCWA. When I first met him, I truly admired his enthusiasm to make ESCWA an efficient organization in achieving sustainable development goals. He then called upon us to showcase Kuwait's experience in this regard. I have 5 minutes to clarify in a summarized manner 5 factors that Dr. Maisa has already mentioned in her presentation. This is what I call the governance of the achievement of SDGs. I shall present some forceful statements, but that are of utmost importance in order to dot the I's. Firstly, in the state of Kuwait, the strategic national dimension and integrated planning approaches rank first on the list of Kuwait's priorities. The 2030 Agenda and SDGs are an integral part and a result of the priority planning and strategic dimensions for the state, and they rank second. We shall start first and foremost with the governance and the matters that we have set forth in order to achieve the governance of the agenda. Firstly, we know that what cannot be measured cannot be run. This is a golden rule that must be taken into account. SDGs encompass numerous indicators, and thankfully the number used to be up and down, as it will be the case in the stock market, but now we have a specific number of KPIs with a first tier, a second tier, and a third tier. Some of the indicators can be measured along with a specific set of data. For tiers 1 and 2, we still lack the statistical and measurable data, and Kuwait is in line with all the Arab countries in this regard. Therefore, we need to be able to have a governance of data to be able to govern the targets. What about the governments within the administration per se? We need to have coordination committees because SDGs and the implementation of the 2030 agenda is a national effort that must rely on all the sectors of the state. Henceforth, a high national commission was created in order to implement the objectives of the agenda that was run by the Statistics Central Administration and the Council of Ministers. And these are the governmental authorities that are responsible for running this process. We have representatives within this committee, mostly the private sector, and Kuwait's 2030 vision relies on the fact that the private sector shall spearhead the reform in the state, and therefore private sector and private enterprises that are mostly listed in the stock exchange and the large-scale Kuwaiti companies are represented on the board of this committee. Now we move on to another facet of representation, which is the civil society organizations, CSOs. CSOs in Kuwait span more than 150 organizations and might reach even 850 organizations, and they can really echo their voices, and we treasure their presentation, such as the Commission for Kuwaiti Engineers, the Committee for Graduates, other committees and organizations that are called upon to participate to the meetings according to the priorities. We also have local observers because the Audit Council in Kuwait is not a governmental authority, but oversees the work of the state of Kuwait. And he is also involved in the work of the implementation of the Agenda 2030. And during the meetings of the United Nations, the State Bureau is called upon to say where is the state currently. And we have also called upon the Higher State Council of Kuwait in order to know what has already been achieved in this regard. We also have international observers, such as a representative of UNDP, as well as a representative of the World Bank. This committee, with all its own components and representatives, has convened numerous times within coordination meetings that further enriched our experience. Therefore, our experience is considered as unique for many reasons, and mostly because of the unified language between all stakeholders in order to achieve development. One of the main challenges that might impair the implementation of the agenda is the language and the unified speech. We need to sensitize vis-à-vis its importance. As His Excellency, the Minister of Morocco, has previously mentioned, we need the logic of the change of culture, because the idea of sustainability is a cultural mindset per se. It is a mindset that is required within the public opinion, a mindset that must prevail for every society to succeed. So we need to raise the awareness of the civil society. The Sustainable Development Program in Kuwait has enabled us, along with the civil society, to raise the awareness of the importance of changing mindsets. Secondly, the General Administration for Statistics has set forth a matrix entitled the Matrix of Responsibilities and Indicators, whereby each indicator has a number of authorities responsible for it, and these authorities shall submit their reports to the relevant minister. The Council of Ministers is formed of different ministers, as we all know, and each minister is responsible for an array of indicators that he is supposed to champion in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda for the state of Kuwait. I am respecting the time that is allotted to me, dear moderator. I shall conclude by saying that Kuwait's experience relies also on a workshop that we have undertaken in September 2015. The next month in 2015, we have called upon all stakeholders and we have set forth the idea of Sustainable Development Plan. The United Nations finished with the MDGs, and now they have provided us with their SDGs. And we said that if we do not have SDGs, we need to have at least some survival goals. So let us work on these sustainable goals so that we will not need to survive. So we have worked on all of these goals. We have achieved a round table along with the private sector and the civil society because they are first and foremost involved in the achievement of this agenda. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Mahdi. Mr. Ahmed Kamali, the floor is yours. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to express my happiness to be present amongst you here in Beirut and in ESCWA once again. I was honored to be on ESCWA's board for 1.5 years, and it was a very pleasant and distinctive experience. I do believe that ESCWA plays a paramount role in advocating the sustainable development goals in the Arab region with amazing capacities. I shall be giving you an airbird view of Egypt's experience, and my presentation will encompass 4 points. The first point is institutional. It has to do with the institutionalization of the theme of sustainable development. The 3 remaining points will have to be practical steps in this regard, i.e., what has the Egyptian government done in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. And if I still have some more time, I shall conclude by tackling the challenges that Egypt is encountering when it comes to sustainable development. Let us start with the institutional efforts to achieve the sustainable development goals in the Republic of Egypt. Egypt has launched the Sustainable Vision 2030 for Egypt early on in 2016, 1 year after the launching of United Nations SDGs. The Ministry of Planning, Follow-up and Administrative Reform leads the process of implementation of sustainable development by a ministerial decree. This will be done through a ministerial national committee that will be commissioned with the follow-up on SDGs and Egypt's 2030 vision. The Ministry of Planning plays the role of the coordinator within this committee, but this committee has on its board some ministers representing the Ministry of Health, Habitat, Education, Social Affairs, Foreign Affairs, Investment and International Cooperation, Environment, Local Development, as well as some important entities and bodies within Egypt, such as the Central Bureau for Mobilization and Statistics, responsible for statistics in Egypt, and the Central Body for Accountability, as well as many other specialized bodies, such as the National Council for Women and the National Council for Special Needs. Many preparatory meetings were held with the participation of many ministries and bodies where SDGs were introduced. We have discussed then what has already been achieved by the ministries and the different entities in the pathway to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have held numerous meetings in order to scrutinize all the efforts that have been exerted in order to achieve our contrived objective. During these meetings, many orientations were already prevailing, including, first, coordination between different ministries and entities is important. Many efforts can be exerted within a single ministry, but can be unknown to the other ministries. And this is why this committee has the role to showcase what has been done within each ministry to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. No single ministry can work single-handedly. Therefore, coordination amongst different stakeholders is pivotal. Secondly, there should be a harmonization and cohesion between UN SDGs and Egypt's 2030 agenda or strategic vision. Some approaches were done in order to better correlate all of these stakeholders. Thirdly, this set of data is extremely important in order to achieve SDGs. We need to know if a specific country is on its way to achieve SDGs. Therefore, we need to have specific indicators, as is the case in this state, and in order to know where is my place on the path to achieve SDGs. Therefore, this data is elementary. During these meetings, the Bureau of Mobilization and Statistics of Egypt is the one producing the data. And therefore, it is essential that all entities will coordinate with this office or bureau in order to better scrutinize this data, to assist this office in expediting the publication of this data, and in order to better bridge the gaps. This can be done not only thanks to the Office of Statistics, but all different relevant ministries and entities should join forces in order to do so. Finally, a unit was created 2 or 3 years ago, and we have specific units for SDGs within each ministry and entity. The sustainable development process was intertwined with the national strategies. Therefore, planning cannot be in a silo away from SDGs, but they have to be correlated and linked together. Allow me to give you some practical steps that we have undertaken. After the institutional review, we move on to the practical facet. One electronic organism was created staff within the ministry has created this electronic organism, and it has to do with guaranteeing the cohesion of all public projects with SDGs. In other words, if the different entities, ministries, or authorities require a credit for a specific project that they would like to carry out, this electronic organism will directly link this project with the SDGs. And I believe this is extremely important. We have already trained all the relevant ministries and relevant staff within the latter. Currently, we are reviewing and updating Egypt's 2030 vision. My colleague, Mr. Abaza, will verse into the details of this process later on. We do believe that Egypt's vision can be altered in light of the economic reality. For instance, Egypt is undertaking an economic reform and the situation is shifting on the ground. Therefore, This vision is updated to be further aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. In a nutshell, allow me to mention the challenges that we are facing. One of the most important challenges is to polarize the private sector to be an active partner in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We rely on an active participation of the private sector in having investment long-term projects that will be aligned with the Sustainable Development Vision. We need to care more for this issue in Egypt, and this is why we consider it as a challenge for the Egyptian government. The second part is a main part of the 2030 Agenda, which is the non-exclusion part. The sustainable development process should be entrenched even at the local levels. Egypt has many provinces. We try to be geared towards an assessment of sustainable development indicators not only at the national level, but also at the provinces level. I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
شكرا سيد أحمد.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. I yield the floor now to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Hamadi. Your Excellency Ghatas Khouri, Minister of Culture and representative of the Prime Minister. Your Excellency Muhammad Ali Hakim, Under-Secretary of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of ESCWA. Your Excellencies, representatives of the League of Arab States. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On the outset, allow me to express my deepest thanks to our brethren in the Lebanese state for their good organization of the fifth session of the Arab Forum for Sustainable Development. I would like to seize this opportunity to congratulate them for presiding the forum for 2018, or for chairing the forum for 2018. And I am highly confident that their chairmanship for this session shall witness many milestones and accomplishments. We ascertain that we are more than willing to provide our support and assistance so that they will be able to undertake their task. I would also like to seize this opportunity to express our deepest thanks to ESCWA and LAS for organizing this forum and for their strenuous efforts in order to organize the sessions and documents of this forum. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the issues of sustainable development rank first on the list of priorities of all Arab countries nowadays. All countries in the Arab region give a lot of attention to SDGs because they represent an important challenge for the future advancement and progress of this region. Without the correct progress in achieving the targets and goals of the 2030 Agenda, it will be very difficult, or rather impossible, to achieve happiness and good living standards for the Arab region, because some Arab countries are suffering from armed conflicts and the disintegration of all governmental institutions and the moralization of the civil fabric, which will hamper any development process from all perspectives. These countries might even see all of their efforts sabotaged because of all of these conflicts. We do believe that development is a cornerstone for a good environment to achieve progress and development. Without these main pillars, it will be strenuous to achieve SDGs. Therefore, the state of Qatar urgently calls for a constructive dialogue amid all political and civil organizations in order to stop wars and in order to find the right platform that will champion development that is deemed pivotal for peace and security. Since the launching of SDGs on September 25th, 2015, the state of Qatar has actively contributed in order to try to achieve these SDGs in the whole region. Doha's declaration paved the way for the progress towards the achievement of SDGs. The state of Qatar is principally always committed to achieving these SDGs on national, regional, and international levels.
Allow me here to reiterate the importance of partnerships to achieve development, because without support, generous support for developmental programs, it will be very difficult to have societies achieve the hoped for development. So the state of Qatar has met all of its obligations, meeting the Objective 17 of the SDGs. And it has voluntarily conducted partnerships with a number of least developed or less developed countries through specific programs in the fields and sectors of education, health, employment, and humanitarian aid. And these assistances have bridged the gap of 17 million child in health and education. And now we are working on more developmental programs for support, specifically in the sector of infrastructure and environment. And this will provide less developed and least developed countries to reach their goals of SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, Qatar, in the past 2 decades, has achieved a lot of progress in growth and development, and this made it move from the countries in the mean tier regarding developed countries to a higher tier. And now it is ranking the first amongst the Arab countries. And we, through the strategy of 2030 and our implementational plan, specifically the last one, 2017-2021, launched by His Excellency Tamim Al-Hamad II at the beginning of this year, in order to also rank higher and higher in the Human Development Index in order to achieve what remains of the SDGs before 2022. Thus, Qatar knows that sustainable development necessitates multiple resources and economic resources specifically. That is why we need to achieve the progress that we have reached so far. And that is how we can clearly see that the Qatari economy is the fastest growing economy in this region. And we are still working on improving the economic indicators through diversity, economic diversity, and good investment in order to achieve progress and growth in all fields of development in order to improve the well-being of the citizens. At the end, I would like to thank all participants for participating in this forum, and we hope that we achieve the results that we want. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Al-Hamadi. Now I give the floor to Mr. Muhammad Al-Hawiri to talk about Yemen. In the name of God, at the outset, I would like to thank the Lebanese state for hosting this forum. I would like to thank Mr. Muhammad Ali Al-Hakim, the Executive Secretary of ESQA Under Secretary, and I would like to also thank all the organizers. I would like to thank the participants as well. I will take a step back and then I reach the present, moving towards the future regarding Yemen and growth as well as development. I will specifically talk about the three main phases for development and planning in Yemen. The first phase started in the 90s of the past century when the Yemeni unity was achieved, and that was the most important achievement in the contemporary history of Yemen and the region, although this unity now is being challenged and threatened. So once this unity was achieved, the base of economic resources widened. The market share and the market volume increased. And thus, that was an opportunity for us in Yemen to think of a strategic vision for a long-term development. And that was what happened. Strategy 2020-22 was established and formulated, aiming at having Yemen as a high-ranking country for economic indicators and human well-being indicators. And then later on, there were other plans looking at the diversification of the different sectors that will be promising for the future, absorbing the different objectives specifically in the 2006-2010 five-year plan. Now, some achievements happened as well as failures. So the lessons learned during that first phase showed us that there was weak coordination, there was weak follow-up by the public entities and weak coordination amongst the different stakeholders. And there was a high dependence on international assistance, where sometimes this assistance was not up to the requested level. And the share was $13 per capita or per citizen of the assistances provided by donor countries. Now, the second phase was the Arab Spring phase. During that time, Yemen, through the Gulf Initiative, reached a certain agreement. And that Gulf Initiative also provided Yemen with a new hope or a new opportunity to even improve and have economic growth and development based on the lessons learned of the first phase. Now, what characterized the second phase were two things. First, there was a national dialogue in Yemeni, including the different sectors, different factions, different national groupings, and that was based on sustainable development in 2011. Before launching. That happened even before launching the International Agenda for Sustainable Development. That was the first year. And there was a dialogue, a national dialogue that took place, and I think you all followed up that. And Yemen nearly provided a model of political transformation that would have been pioneering. However, developments or some events interfered and just destroyed all those aspirations and dreams. And the third phase is that, or a second part in the second phase, is that there was a new vision based on this new reality where we had a federal state including different regions, and once again a new 2013 vision was formulated, reaching to 2030. But as I said, circumstances interfered and our aspirations were crushed. We move immediately to the third phase. It is the current one. So today, Yemen is going through civil strife, war, and it has been the case for the past 3 years. And when there was a coup and there was an attack on the international consensus and the outcomes of the national dialogue, and all this was done, of course, by the Houthis. So now what we are trying to do is think of launching a program for the reconstruction of Yemen that will include the SDGs. Of course, that will include the SDGs in the project or in the program. Now, at the institutional level, there was a higher committee for reconstruction that was established, headed by the Minister of Reconstruction and Planning, as well as other relevant ministers from line ministries, in order to look at the economic growth process. And we are also thinking of a national team for economic development and reconstruction. And thus, we are working on a report that will show us the statu quo vis-à-vis sustainable development. Now, of course, in light of the circumstances that we are going through, the state faces many challenges, many difficulties. Most important challenge, and here, of course, I'm not talking about the statistical approach, because in light of lack of resources and weakness of institutions, we cannot come up with the specific figures, but there are even more circumstances that are more dangerous. So these challenges are the environment that is not stable at all, whether we are talking about political environment, security environment, or social one. So based on war, we have a lot of wounds that are physical and wounds that are in the mindsets and thinking of the citizens. Because the state is weak, it is unable to achieve its responsibilities. Another challenge is that we had external migration. There were so many intellectuals, so many educated people who left Yemen. We also have a problem with the displaced. We have 3 million displaced inside and 1 million outside, moving from Yemen to beyond the borders. So this also faces a challenge in light of all the endeavors for sustainable development. Consequently, we say, of course, there are challenges, but we have hope, because opportunities come from the midst of challenges and strives and darkness as well. So we see that there is an opportunity for Yemen, because there is an international consensus on supporting Yemen, on taking Yemen out of this predicament, supporting Yemen financially, as well as supporting Yemen to regain its well-being. With the help of God, this will happen. And that is why we see two tracks regarding the opportunities. First, in light of the continuation of the armed crisis, we need to look at health indicators and educational indicators, but not at the national level, but also at the level of the regions, but rather at the level of the regions within Yemen. There are safe zones in which we can implement many programs, many projects that will allow us to achieve the SDGs. However, at the national level, once war ends, once the civil war ends, once stability is regained, I think we will have a much bigger opportunity that will allow us to move forward to achieve the SDGs. Knowing fully well that the reconstruction project will provide more job employments and that will allow us to achieve the SDGs. There is also a possibility to strengthen the partnerships at the local level, even if now we are suffering from that. But we can also strengthen the partnerships not only at the national level, but also at the regional and international levels. And there are opportunities that we can search for everywhere within this instability. But the biggest opportunity is when the war ends and when Yemen returns to its past glory and happiness. Now, of course, Yemen was happy at the time. It used to be called the happy Yemen. And let us hope that in the future, Yemen will also be happy just as it was in the past. Thank you, Mr. Hawiri. Now we give the floor to Mr. Rifat Hijazi to listen to the experience of Syria. Thank you. Good morning. I will try to very quickly talk about three main issues related to the process of development and the integration of sustainable development in Syria. First, the methodology of working with the SDGs within the national planning framework in Syria. While formulating the SDGs or while moving towards them at the international level, everyone started or moved from the national frameworks, moving towards the regional frameworks. And then the regional priorities were discussed in the General Assembly, and later on the SDGs were born. We in Syria, what we did was include the SDGs at the national level and focusing on the local development process. So what we did was look at our national priorities. So the SDGs are not new goals to developmental plans in all countries. So all countries have these plans with the same goals. So what is new in the SDG? What is new in the SDGs is what is being forgotten today, that it is not only 17 goals and 118 targets and 140 indicators, but rather it is a vision that was summarized by 2 words: transforming our world. 3 words: transforming our world. It is an international vision at the international or global level. So if we look at the targets of SDGs, we can come up with the fact that no state, no government alone, especially developing countries, cannot achieve SDGs, because out of the 17 goals, 9 goals are transboundary and are regional in nature, and even in international matters of natural resources, water resources, pollution. And in the morning it was said that the water resources spring from outside of the Arab world, as well as air pollution. There is no, or there are no borders in the air, as well as the influx of arms that are transboundary and cross borders, as well as the illicit migration and the matter of migrants. The economic embargo is also beyond one country alone. So if we don't look at these goals from a perspective of transforming our world, and that it is an international consensus to achieve development, then no Arab country alone can achieve the SDGs. We all have to alleviate poverty and decrease the different poverty indicators. We want all to improve education and health, but there are other things that guarantee the sustainability of development, not through materialistic means, but rather through issues that are forced on the region, coming outside of the region, because unfortunately we are a country that we are still countries that consume technology. So when there is an embargo on or a siege on technology in the Arab region, then this will negatively impact many relevant points in sustainable development, meaning using clean technology, investments, etc. So these, and regarding the SDGs in Syria, we have come up with the first national report and the first VNR. And the main point was to see what we have achieved out of these SDGs with the end of the year 2015, to know how to tackle them in the coming plan. Now, the second objective was to see the impact of the war on Syria regarding SDG frameworks, and we came up with 2 gaps. In our national report for sustainable development, we said there is a weakness in developmental approaches. So even if there was no war, would we have been able to achieve the SDG? And then the second one, the gaps that we were negatively impacted by due to the war. And here, of course, we are talking about financial gaps, human losses, as well as financial losses, as in addition to problems with different sustainable development related indicators. Now, we looked at the plan given to us by the UN, and we have designed the plan according to the Syrian indicators, because in Syria we had a problem. We wanted to know what were the main problems we were suffering from, because do we look at 2011 or do we look at 2017, where in 2017 we also are still suffering from many problems. So we wanted also to look at the future, reaching the year 2030, because some goals and targets are asked to be achieved by the year 2020 and 2025. In the National Report for Sustainable Development, we have also talked about some policy-related points in order to link with sustainable or national development. And thus we reach the challenges that we face, or the challenges faced by the state, the Syrian state, to achieve the SDGs. Now, how did we link the SDGs to the national plan? Syria and since the beginning of this year has launched work on the national plan for helping Syria after the war. So we are looking at post-war Syria through an economic perspective based on 5 titles. First, national dialogue and political plurality. Second, the human dimension. The third title, growth and economic development. Fourth title, institutional reform, as well as enforcing integrity. So these are the 4 titles where we looked at the titles or the different 17 goals according to the 5 titles that our program has adopted. We did not want to deal with the SDGs as a foreign body in parallel with our national plan for our national development, because our plan will succeed if we or the SDGs will succeed if we include them in our national plan, because we cannot look at our national plan for development separately from the SDGs. So this way we have integrated SDG in the national development plan because we did not consider the SDGs as a foreign body. Now Syria is still suffering from the consequences and impact of war, although we know that in most Syrian regions the war has stopped, but nevertheless we still have problems. So we started with the development process, and we divided in our national plan, in the post-war national plan, we divided the work to 4 phases. The first phase looking at the humanitarian needs and making sure that we preserve and support the well-being of the citizen as well as the unity of the state. And then the last phase is the sustainable development and the national development. So going through 2 phases. First, looking at humanitarian needs. A second phase, that of recovery. The second phase is the phase of recovery that has already started being implemented in many regions with reconstruction. The third phase is economic and social recovery. And the fourth is economic development or sustainability of development. But this will not be applied in the same pace according to the region, because now we have some regions that have entered the recovery phase, whereas other regions are still suffering from terrorism and where the Syrian state still has to interfere in the first phase, and that is relief work. Now now of course we know that damage also plays a role, and that is how our interference will be impacted. Thank you, Mr. Hijazi. I would like to thank all of you for your presentation, but let us go into a discussion now with some details. So we look at a more practical process. Mr. Mahdi, regarding Kuwait, you have spoken about the coordination that is there, integrated coordination amongst the different public entities on the one hand and the private sector. So private sector and civil society organization cooperation with the public entities. Now, in what fields have you succeeded more? In which sectors have you been more successful than, and which sectors still need more work regarding Kuwait? If I am to talk about dividing the 17 goals and looking specifically at what we have achieved, this is not the way we are working. And like I said in my intervention at the very beginning, the national priorities and the working program of the state and the developmental plan of the state come first. All these come first. And what will come out of these of this plan as outcomes will be reflected towards the end on the indicators that we find in the SDGs. Now, there are some goals that were mentioned and that were included in the Agenda 2030, and where Kuwait has achieved a lot. For example, the concepts related to Goal 17, and that is international partnerships. And like everyone knows, Kuwait is the friend of the United Nations. And Kuwait is also the center for humanitarian work. And the Kuwaiti prince was a pioneer for humanitarian work. in the region. So regarding Goal 17, we have high achievements. And Kuwait provides 1.78 of the GDP, and sometimes it has reached 2.3 of the GDP. So when we talk about goal like Goal 17, it has been highly achieved. Now, let us put aside what we have achieved and rather focus on what we still have some weaknesses in. Now, these gaps and weaknesses are important because when we come up with a program that is a strategic map, we do that in order to bridge the gaps and tackle the weaknesses. We have a number of gaps. Now, the biggest gap that is the point here is the human capital. So the human capital includes many considerations. First, we have to consider education. No two disagree on the importance of education because building the human being is more important than construction. So we suffer and we face many challenges in education. The indicators are not optimistic at all. That is why a big plan of the developmental plan is to have the educational system in harmony with the economic vision built on knowledge, know-how, and the fourth industrial revolution. Now, many of these components in this new international orientation or this new transformation of the world, as is mentioned in the agenda, is based on human capital. And I don't call that human resources. I'm not mentioning human resources, but human capital, because if we don't have resources, then we won't have geography and we won't have a human capital. So this is what will transform the world. On this, the transformation will be made, whether we are talking about our Arab region or even the interaction with the different regions. This is one challenge. This is a main challenge. A second challenge is that related to governance, institutional governance. And that is of the utmost importance because it reinforces transparency, the principles of transparency and integrity. And they are considered the safety valves in the developmental process. So we can come up with the best of strategies, best of implementation plans. However, concepts and principles of governance, integrity, and transparency are the three principles that push this development not only one step forward, but many steps forward. Education, institutional governance, those are two. Now, third, leadership of the private sector. Leadership of the private sector in development. And here, of course, I'm talking about the challenges in Kuwait, and I think many other countries share those challenges. So, economic diversification and having the private sector a leader in the developmental process. So these topics need to be looked at from a different perspective, where the state needs to alleviate its pressure on the economy and operationalizing the economy, where we know that the state remains the supervisor, the observer for managing the economy. And it has to move away little by little. And this is a challenge that we find in our national plan in our national plan. So the state needs to move a little bit from the operational component in the economic sector. And this will positively be reflected on so many other components. Now, the remaining component is that of the environment. And just like my colleague, Dr. Hijazi, mentioned, there is something very important, because there is something that includes cross borders. So anything related to cross-border interaction should be considered as global by nature and not local at all, or not local only and not regional only. For example, many countries have signed the climate change agreement as well as financing development in Addis Ababa, climate change in Paris, the agendas. Well, however, there are international responsibilities that need to be assumed, global responsibilities that need to be assumed. And here we need to submit the state to look at the different environmental indicators. However, anything that is cross-border by nature cannot be submitted and cannot be put under this headline. So here we are in a maze. Thus, achieving the goal will be micro and not macro in nature. And I will conclude by just saying the dialogue, raising awareness, are both very important. Now, in raising awareness about sustainability in development, we have to focus on development first, and then talking about sustainability of development. So I was explaining to secondary students something, and I said, no one should be left behind. And this is the slogan carried by the United Nations. And the student told me something. Where are they going? Where are they going? To Mars? To planet Mars? Now, at the beginning, I laughed, but this is a message. So if the world is moving towards inclusion, so inclusion and not leaving anyone behind, meaning that we will create a huge gap between those who will go and those who will remain. And thus, this is dangerous, because if we do not move in that direction, people will leave us and go to Mars. Thank you.
شكرا سيد مهدي.
Thank you, Mr. Mahdi. Mr. Kamal, as regards Egypt, the security challenges that Egypt is facing mostly in combating terrorism in Sinai, to what extent can that be detrimental to Egypt's development plans, notably in light of the fact that Egypt suffers from poverty, unemployment, and many other challenges? So what about the security facets? Can it be really somewhat replacing development? Thank you for asking this question. As we use a terminology in economy, the indigenous and exogenous, i.e. something affects economy. We cannot have a social development and an economic development without a political stability. If we look at the International Competitiveness Index, we see that Egypt ranks lower nowadays in comparison to the past. And part of that decrease was because of security incidents, terrorist attacks, and the lack of political stability. And I do believe that this negatively impacts any development plans. It resembles a shockwave that will shake the foundations of development and any developmental path that Egypt wishes to take. But it is endogenous. There is a trend nowadays in Egypt to care for the rural provinces and for Sinai. This goes in line with the Sustainable Development Plan. Within any Sustainable Development vision, no one must be left behind. There is an indefinite correlation between any terrorist incidents and development poverty. In other words, terrorist attacks are skyrocketing in the areas that are not so fortunate when it comes to social and economic development. Therefore, the current trend is to focalize on the most needy provinces, such as the rural provinces and the province of Sinai, as well as other border provinces. When I first took the floor, I talked about challenges. Egypt is the biggest Arab country. Therefore, it is difficult to consider that Cairo, the southern part of Sinai, are the same. There is a huge disparity amid all different provinces, especially when it comes to development. Therefore, more attention should be drawn to the provinces that are in dire need of development. Egypt's plan for sustainable development is veering towards this need. Thank you. Mr. Hamadi, you have broached the importance of ceasing any strifes and conflicts in the region. I echo your voice, and we will delve into the details of this issue more with the representative of Syria. Have these conflicts affected Qatar's special development plan? We have talked a lot about economic diversity, but I do believe that the state of Qatar has its own specificity. Was it affected anyhow? Thank you, Ms. Dalal. Allow me first to introduce the terminology of development in any country. In all countries, should you ask an official about any development plan in his or her own country, the answer will be human resources, education, health, economy. Yet, some countries have a specificity on a certain level that they would like to combat. In the state of Qatar, we have a national vision that was promulgated 10 years ago, and it focuses first on the human being, on education, on health and economy. We have succeeded in the fields of health and education because we are exerting numerous efforts to have a successful scenario in this regard. Economy is working as well. Once we have a strong economy, it can shoulder the health sector as well as the education sector. We have higher levels of university education amongst women, especially. Thankfully, our economy is solid. However, our future plan is not only to rely on our current sources, i.e. oil and gas, but we need to increase our investments in the Gulf area and to transcend that to go internationally. There are 42 countries around the world, approximately. We can invest in many fields and sectors. Any country suffering from strife will witness a decline in economy. It is without a shadow of a doubt. But how can we overcome the situation if there is a contingency, if a war is waged, if a siege is imposed? We can always find ways to palliate this obstacle. We have encountered a lot of hurdles, but we were able to assuage them thanks to the strength of our economy and thanks to our external relationship with the international world, thanks to our international cooperation and humanitarian work with the United Nations. And hopefully things will become more positive. Thank you. Mr. Al-Hawiri, you have spoken of Yemen and the 3 stages that Yemen went through. What about the current status quo? You have said that it is not possible to have a plan in the absence of a specific political stability. In light of the war and conflict prevailing in Yemen, how can you act? What are the priorities? Destruction cripples the country. There are higher social demands and needs, so you cannot think of a sustainable development plan. Can you give us some small examples on how you perceive development in the future? Currently, in light of the current conflict, we were able to regain the country's institutions, and we were able to translate this priority on the ground. And regaining more institutions is a further priority. We have 4 major priorities. We have a humanitarian problem because of this conflict. Therefore, catering for humanitarian needs thanks to interventions with the factions that were affected by war, i.e. the internally displaced, the wounded, and the people who lost their homes. This is our short-term priority. And even in the transitional phase, when we reach a peaceful phase, the state regains all of its institutions, and when water flows again smoothly, I do believe that we will think of development. Regaining security and having once again the upper hand over the institutions and establishing peace and security might be the first priorities. Then we might think of any economic later recovery and reconstruction. In light of the destruction to infrastructure, our priorities within the 5 forthcoming years will be funding that amount to billions of dollars, according to studies by the United Nations and the World Bank and other organizations as well. Then we might think of other priorities pertaining to humanitarian aspects, developmental aspects, and other social and economic aspects. Society is really crippled in Yemen. We have a higher index of poverty and unemployment, and these are short-term priorities. But in the long run, or in the medium run, we have identified 6 main priorities. These priorities are phased in, firstly, by regaining services, and then we move on to the development after the economic recovery and the progress of different sectors. We will reinforce PPPs, we will reinforce the role of the civil society in the future stage. We will think of recovering the investment environment. We will look into a complementarity with the GCC. So these are all priorities. It is a difficult equation for sure. We have needs in relation to reconstruction and priorities, and we have objectives in relation to sustainable development. We also have our vision relying on the unified Yemen. How can we align amid all of these priorities? This is the most important issue that we think of currently. Right now, all efforts are exerted to determine the needs for sustainable development, whether in terms of finance, humans, or others. In my perspective, mostly in the first stages of conflict, any planning is disrupted. Many interventions happen here and there without any coordination or complementarity in order to achieve any contrived objectives. We are currently thinking of establishing a body for reconstruction that will play the role of coordination, of funding, and execution, as is the case in Lebanon, in order to better absorb all of these priorities, whether in recovery or in reconstruction or in regaining all states' institutions. Furthermore, we are trying to have an economic council that will align the monetary policy, the reconstruction policy, and any other developmental policies. Thank you, Mr. Hijazi. What about Syria? I have two questions after what you have said. I am sure that there are many factors and parameters that require international cooperation. To be able to have planning, you need data and figures to carry out any developmental studies. In Syria, a demographic change was imposed by the war. Large numbers of people were displaced from one area to another, which changed the facet of Syria on the ground. I do believe there is a great need for coordination, and I do not know if you are coordinating with the forces on the ground. How can you plan? In addition to the large-scale destruction, the displacement in huge numbers of Syrians from one area to another, knowing that the war is reaching its end, but it's still active in some areas. So you need a political agreement. In this framework, how are you dealing with all of these factors? When it comes to the production of data, the first requirement out of the planning requirements, we can say that data production never ceased. Since 2011 to date, on a yearly basis, the Statistical Bureau has undertaken many surveys. In a couple of days, we will have the outcome of the demographic and social survey that will cover all governorates and Syrian regions, and it was done thanks to a technical cooperation from UNDP. 4 days ago, before I came here directly, we have launched the outcomes of the food-related survey that we have done in cooperation with FAO. And it was the second phase because the first phase was in 2015, and we shall start with the outcomes of the third survey soon. We have data at the national level. We have suffered from a certain problematic in relation to data from Idlib, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa, only these three governorates, because it was really difficult to have access to these regions and to be able to garner the relevant data. Some regions also lacked security, and so we will take data from the displaced persons that came to another region about what happened there. We were also able to retrieve some data of the regions that lacked stability. Question: are you also taking into account the refugees outside of Syria? Answer: we might not be able to communicate with the refugees in the neighboring countries. We used to be able to have data thanks to UN agencies such as UNHCR, and we used to have a constant flow of data. As for the demographic displacement, migration, and refugees have peaked by reaching a number of 7 million displaced after regaining peace and security in many Syrian areas. This number of people going back to their homes reaches half, around 3 millions, and therefore we can see that security is somewhat being restored there. This is what allured them to come back. Some people were displaced, their houses were destroyed, and these persons will not go back unless a certain strategy was adopted. After the liberation of a specific region, there is a phase of reconstruction to reinstate the basic services such as water, electricity, health centers, as well as subsidies for persons to reconstruct their homes. After the liberation of Douma, 5 schools started functioning. After 15 days, drinking water and electricity will also be provided. This is the approach that the Syrian government is opting for. In light of crises and wars, we can always work in sustainable development, because sustainable development is not an overnight business. You have to plan it for 17 and 20 years. It is a lifelong process. Indeed, we have a crisis, therefore we have priorities in terms of reconstruction and regaining industrial and agricultural activities. We are moving ahead, but we need to have a vision. We need to be forward-looking. In the absence of any vision, we might take 2 steps forward and then fall back a bit. Evidently, we do not have any basic problem in terms of data. The Sustainable Development Report shall be published soon. It was prepared with UNDP. At the central level, 300 experts partook to this report, and they represented academics and universities, research centers, private sector. So we did not only work at the central level, but we also went to the Syrian governorates and held some workshops. Mrs. Aitab Taqi from UNDP accompanied us to Aleppo and to other Syrian governorates and provinces in order to expand the participation to the preparation of the report. We were not only pleased with the national data and formulated our report per se, we wanted even to expand the participation either in terms of preparation or in identifying the national priorities. So we have held many workshops whereby around 470 to 480 persons took part to, and they have covered all facets of the civil society. I would like to thank you, dear panelists, for your participation. Now we throw the floor open to any questions and answers. Fawzi Ziyud, Director of IM Office in Lebanon. We really enjoyed this conversation and your valuable presentations. We were thrilled with the pioneering Kuwaiti experience about international observers, about governance and transparency and accountability and dialogue. We're also thrilled with the Egyptian experience when it comes to the electronic organism, which is a pioneering experience as well. We also listened to your presentation on challenges when it comes to sustainable development in Egypt. We heard also the presentation of the state of Qatar. Partnerships in sustainable development are amazing. We have followed on the national dialogue in Yemen in 2013, and it was a successful example. We have also listened to the presentation on the 2 gaps in Syria and the national 5-phased report. I believe this is amazing. All national authorities need to include the leaders of political parties, and they need to have a say in these national dialogues. We need also to include or involve the persons that migrated out of their countries. We need to take into account the displaced, the refugees, the human-centered organizations, women organizations, and all organizations on the ground. We know that Many organizations work in the provinces, in the governorates, and not only in the center, the heart of the capital. And it is important to listen to their opinions. Furthermore, it is important to have a higher level of planning and implementation by including the National Council for Privatization and Governance, as well as universities, private sector, and the statistical office that plays an instrumental role in some countries. We all know that there's a delay in surveys and statistics in some countries. The media rhetoric is also very important, and how we can really reach out to the public opinion. How can we reach the level of their thinking, because they definitely need services. Thank you. 3 more minutes before we conclude. Thank you. My name is Mohammed Saida from the Royal Society in Jordan and a member of the Sustainable Development Plan for 2015. We enjoyed your presentations, dear panelists, but the most important headline of this session is transformative process, because the usual business will not pave the way for the aspired development. Mrs. Maisa showed in the morning that we have the worst figures in the world. So my question is as follows: what can we do in order to better emphasize this transformation and to really induce a change and development? And this is a very important question at the national, regional, and international level. What steps are we to take in order to reach the sustainable development, since we have failed to do so in the past? Muflih Abadi from the Swiss Embassy. SDG 6 was about water management, and one further component was added to this goal in relation to transboundary cooperation. So what about the national efforts in order to achieve this sustainable development agenda? Is there a plan amid all Arab countries? Is there any component within their visions in order to involve joint basins, since we are speaking of water? And we saw that in comparison to the global trend, the highest levels of water consumption reside in the Arab countries. Climate change is virtual, but when we speak of physical resources, or rather the shared physical resources, what can we do in this regard?
ليلى وليد علي، عضو مجلس النواب الشعب.
From Tunisia, parliamentarian from Tunisia. Unfortunately, we did not hear that if we wanted to achieve the sustainable development goals, we need a political will. In my opinion, a country that lacks a solid political power in this regard cannot be able to achieve expeditedly sustainable development. I would like to talk about the experience of Tunisia. You have mentioned governance, and I add to governance democracy and freedom of speech that play a pivotal role in achieving sustainable development. We have an evidence to that. The Tunisian constitution, after the pressure of the public opinion, stipulated something very important, i.e. the Constitutional Committee for the Future Generations. And this is a very important committee that will oversee the sustainability of projects, mostly large-scale ones. Within the Constitution, we have more than 10 chapters that delve in these aspects, mostly in terms of sustainable development. Why do we speak of the importance of democracy and freedom of speech? The pressure imposed by the media and the public opinion, and when political parties speak of sustainable development in their slogans, but upon voting laws and under the eyes of the media, all political parties might fail to respect what they have promised in their programs. Equality amongst all factions of society. Democracy, freedom of speech might have been the motto, but unfortunately, any laws pertaining to these important factors will not be voted for. When a law pertains to sustainable development and the 17 SDGs wants to be voted for, we can see that all political parties fail to vote for it. For instance, when we voted for Tunisia's commitment in the climate meeting for the first time, the parliament voted 100%, and this is very important. Furthermore, any overseeing process by the mass media and by the public opinion on any delay in achieving SDGs is very important. And this is why I wanted to talk about the beautiful experience of democracy in Tunisia. It might be paired with some instability, but when it comes to SDGs, it plays an instrumental role.
بس لنختم بتصور
To conclude, I will say that the Arab region has really gone through many circumstances. It is changing, it's being transformed. In some areas there has been progress, others there has been a deterioration of some sort. There are many changes, specifically social changes that will impose on us other plans or other approaches. We will conclude with you, sir. Thank you very much. Dr. Tahab Al-Hassan, Director General of the Administration for Planning from the Ministry in Libya. First, we are very happy to listen to the experiences of the different Arab countries and what the gentlemen have already told us about their own experiences. And these experiences are diversified if we look at them from one country to another, of course, respecting the specificity of every country. And at the end, achieving what is necessary is to look at the SDG or achieve the SDGs of the 2030 agenda. And each plan has strategies, has plans, has different guidelines, hoping to reach the achievement of the SDGs. We in Libya, despite the facts that and the circumstances that we are going through, so in Libya, the state has been very keen and interested in those regions. For example, regarding water security, we have the Industrial River Project, and it is a huge project to pump or to move water from the heart of the desert to the north. And this has provided a better opportunity for the per capita share of the Libyan citizen. And of course, the contracts have been signed in 2008 with more than 140 billion in value. Now, all these projects will allow the Libyans to really work on infrastructure to improve their whether infrastructure or educational sector or other sectors. So there will be a quantum leap in improving the life of the citizens. So I'm very happy to be with you today, and I hope that, hopefully, I say Libya in the near future will assume its role and will provide the VNR. Now, the report for 2015 has been completed, but regarding 2030, we are still behind. We have a national committee under the Ministry of Planning. Thank you. We will conclude this session. And thank you for your presence. Thank you for your participation.
بعد مين؟ كانوا بدهم يختموا. بعد معنا وقت أما بنختم. لا question. 1 minute. طيب بعد شي مجال لسؤال بليز. دولة فلسطين تفضل.
شكرا.
Thank you. The agenda clearly focuses on partnership, and there's a conviction and a whole approval of partnership. But the partnership in itself is a challenge in Palestine. So my question to the colleagues, if any of you can answer me, what are the challenges that were faced in reinforcing the partnership amongst the three entities? And what are the best options or alternatives to achieve that? Now, I would have wished that our colleagues from Syria and Yemen have already said that achieving sustainable development necessitates an empowering environment or enabling environment. And this is something we agree on. But the ESQA and the state of, or the League of Arab States also play an important role. So what do they do to guarantee the capacity of states to meet their responsibilities and obligations? Maybe this is a forum that will allow us to assemble our efforts, but later on, after this meeting, we might need another enabling factor to allow the different countries and states to reach their objectives. Would anyone like to answer regarding cooperation and partnership? I want to talk about 2 points very quickly. First, regarding partnership, we had an experience that was very successful, especially with the private sector and the civil society institutions and organizations. We were having a committee for partnership where each will participate, and specifically the private sector. And maybe this partnership is also a challenge at the same time. So the civil society organizations are very diversified, and we face many problems and challenges in this regard. So this is first. Second, regarding the role of ESQA, I would like to commend and say that ESQA has really played a very important role, and Dr. Muhammad Al-Hakim has adopted a comprehensive integrated project from ESQA for reconstruction in Yemen. And there are huge efforts being deployed in order to counter the negative social and economic impacts, the impacts on the future generations, and so many other titles within this integrated, comprehensive project. And next week, we will meet with the representative of the different public institutions. You will meet, sir, with them in order so that they talk to you about their own integrated project and what they need under the supervision and with the support of ESQA. Thank you. Mr. Kamali, there was something you wanted to add? Regarding my colleague from Tunisia, the political will is of course there, and all our colleagues from the Arab countries know about that, because without, or in the absence of political will, specifically in the Arab countries, so without political will, we cannot work on sustainable development issues. Mr. Muhammad talked about that. In Egypt, there are so many things that have been achieved. For example, in pollution, regarding the Nile pollution, there were industrial plants that used to throw their polluted water into the Nile River. So these plants were stopped. Now, regarding energy as well, there is a different approach in dealing and consuming energy. I was with the Ministry of Social Affairs last week, and I heard the minister saying, do you see the electricity in this building? All this is based on solar energy. And also, we had the solar cell panels that were feeding the building all over. So those solar cell panels were everywhere. And any surplus will be pumped into the electric grid. So there are so many examples that we can talk about. So, of course, there are many examples that can be talked about in the Arab countries, but time is not enough. Thank you. Thank you for adding. We apologize, but we have to conclude. And I would like to thank all of you once again for your presence and for giving us your own experiences. Thank you, everyone.
عفواً سيتم هناك استراحة لمدة ساعة للغداء.
1 hour break. 1 hour break in the cafeteria.